Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sky Lila Experience. Today we have Natasha Nazerali, who is a spiritual entrepreneur on top of being my absolute soul sister. We've known each other since before we were born, probably several lifetimes ago. I think our souls are intertwined, but we're actually just a couple hours apart when we were born in this lifetime. So we love that. Thanks for coming on today, Tash. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Me too. I'm happy to talk to you always.
Always, I know. It's just fun. We get to record it. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about, well, everything to do with Natasha. Natasha is one of the most extraordinary people you will have ever met. And if you know her, you know she's just something special. So
Aw.
what's interesting about Tash is one, well, you're a dancer. You've been dancing your entire life and then have shifted to a jewelry brand, and now you've
Yep.
shifted into a conscious brand. Can you explain that journey a little bit, please?
Yeah, totally. It's definitely been a multi-dimensional wild ride.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I was a professional dancer for almost over 7 years and grew up dancing my whole life. I went to a college and conservatory in New York and Los Angeles for dance. And then I was scouted in college and had a really beautiful career in LA, dancing in film and TV, and on a touring show as well. And that was amazing and a beautiful experience and very fulfilling.
Mhm.
But I think eventually life pulled me in a different direction. And I'm really glad it did because when, this pandemic happened and I couldn't tour anymore because everything was shut down and the world was shut down, I really had to pivot in a new way. And
Mhm.
I think that's also such an important part of being an entrepreneur is learning how to pivot. So when I had all this time to myself, I really came back home into working with my own consciousness and expanding my own self development because now I wasn't dancing anymore. And it was this sort of journey of self discovery of who I am if I'm not a dancer, because I had always labeled myself in this box. And so I'm really grateful for that time because it allowed me an opportunity to finally envision myself beyond just the limitations of my mind of what I thought I always wanted to do. And I had sort of also come to the point in my dance career where I had done all the things. I had worked with artists, I had traveled, I had toured. And so it was also a good timing of I experienced the things I set out to do in that career. And now I wanted something else that nourished me, not only on the physical level, but also on the spiritual level. So I went back into spirituality. I started training at the College of Psychic Studies in the UK, and I decided to create this sort of conscious brand, which was a jewelry product that was ethical. It was made with all recycled gold and grown diamonds. So nothing was mined. And I launched a first collection with over 20 products. Everything was very alchemized and conscious. Each piece was named I am, just to reinforce the alchemy of it. And
Yeah.
that was a really beautiful journey in starting something new. So not only was I creating a conscious product, but at the same time, I was studying in the College of Psychic Studies and I was expanding my own spiritual gifts and what it meant to me. So it was sort of this really wild journey of all these things I thought I wanted to do. And
Right.
spirit was like, no
Yeah.
thanks. So, in the process of all that, as I'm expanding my own spiritual relationship and I'm creating this conscious brand, I also moved back in with my mom, who is like a total hippie mom, just like yours.
Yeah.
So, Skyla and I grew up absolutely as hippie love childs, just
Yeah.
learning how to meditate and do
Yeah.
yoga from a young age.
True.
So, this pandemic, not touring anymore, not working, and coming back home to my roots, to my mom, was just such a remembrance of, oh, yeah, this is how life should be with this ease and grace, and how you can really weave through life with this more expanded connection to nature. And my mom at the time was teaching the 5 biological laws of nature, GNM. And I had all this time coming home with her. So while I was doing all the jewelry, while I was studying my own psychic spiritual gifts, I was also working with her as an educator and helping to get her education platform online and to reach more people. Because I think over the past few years, people have looked at health in a different way. And so she was really booming. And so I started to teach with her.
Mm.
And we started to create also an educational platform together and an educational community. And it started with just, I mean, 2 students, one of them being your sister, and your
Yeah.
family has learned this work.
Mhm.
And now we're at over 150. So it's just kind of one of those things where you think you know what you want, and then the universe shows you what you're actually meant to do, but you have to be open to receive that. And I think that was the beauty of the journey, is I finally quieted down and came home and was finally open to also receive that guidance about what my true purpose was.
Funny because
So
when you say come
yeah.
home, I hear it almost in two senses because you physically came home, but I think spiritually you came home.
Yeah, and even the word home is like like that's
Yeah.
all you have to
Yeah.
do. It's literally in the word telling you how to come home. And
Oh,
so all that being said, like, what do I do now? What does my life look like now? I'm still using those spiritual gifts and working with clients one-on-one. And then I'm also with my mom together teaching this psychic roots of disease, our true biology,
mhm.
totally in alignment with nature. And it's all intertwined because spirituality and the body, this is our only physical vessel we have. So everything comes together. And then I have conscious products as well with my jewelry Wonderlust. So I finally, after 4 years of figuring out, whoa, I'm just,
Nice.
following the universe where it takes me, finally codified it into a platform where all my products are Wonderlust, the heirlooms that are wonderful, that we lust for and inherit,
Mhm.
and everything conscious goes under my brand Wondheirland. So yeah,
Love it.
that's how it works.
Thank you for explaining that because I know what you do, but to explain it is a whole nother level. Can you elaborate on the 5 biological laws, please? What is that even? Is somebody who's never heard of this before, how do you explain it in the most simple terms? And then how does that affect your life? Know,
Right.
knowing this information, because that's the game changer.
Truly. Yeah. So big thing to codify, but I will try my best to break it down as easily and as digestibly as I can. So the 5 biological laws of nature are really the awareness of how our true biology works. And this is something I was raised on because my mom came across this over 20 years ago, and she studied with educators and practitioners around the world to build up her own knowledge within this body of work and to be able to teach it and work with it with others. So for me, it was sort of just a holistic awareness that I was raised on, but now it is a body of work that is used and studied across the world today. So I will start with the fundamentals. It is the 5 biological laws of nature as discovered by Dr. Hammer in the 1980s. So he was working in oncology. He was a medical doctor. He also was a surgeon and an entrepreneur himself. He developed some of the scalpels that are still used around the world internationally in the OR, in the operating room today. And he developed testicular cancer after the very tragic death of his son. And
Mm.
he had this idea that there is no coincidence that this cancer came after the extremely traumatic event of losing his child. So he sought out to provide evidence that the psyche and the organs and our body are working in absolute synchronicity, and that our body is adapting to our environment constantly. And this is something like your listeners already feel to be true. We can understand this in the conscious community, that this is linked, that our physical symptoms are manifestations of what our psyche is experiencing. And
Mhm.
so he had this same hypothesis as well. And because he was working in oncology and he had access to so many cancer patients, he really sought out to be able to codify this in a body of work so that everybody could understand how their true biology works.
Mhm.
Um, so he went through many brain scans and over 5,000 patients. He also presented his work at the university level to be recognized by academics internationally. And he codified the information into what he calls the 5 biological laws. All
Mhm.
right. And then he created the body of work. And also, you might know it as German new medicine or Germanic healing knowledge. Why did he do that? So many people are like, why is it called German new medicine, or why Germanic healing knowledge? The reason why is because he was actually trying to demonstrate that this was knowledge of biology that our ancestors already knew. So
Mhm.
the Germanic people were our ancestors, were the European ancestors. They were poets, they were philosophers. They actually created Yuletide, Christmas that we celebrate today. And they lived in alignment with nature very naturally, very holistically.
Mhm.
And they knew this information already. So
Mhm.
he called it Germanische Heilkunde as a nod to his ancestors, as a hint, as a message to humanity that this information is nothing new. Our ancestors and shamans and tribes around the world, indigenous people, have already known this to be true about our biology. So he was paying homage to his ancestry and lineage. And a lot of people are confused by that. They're like, why is it named that? So I just clear that up first. That's why he named it that. It has nothing to do with Germany, and it has nothing to do with medicine. It was actually Germanische Heilkunde, Germanic healing knowledge. And
Amazing.
all of the work
Mhm.
falls under 5 laws of nature. Yeah.
Mhm.
So if you're ready, I think I'll go into them one by one super quickly just
Yeah.
to give you an idea. Does that sound
Mhm.
good?
Yeah.
We're not lost yet?
No,
Okay.
no, we love it. I mean, I love it,
Okay.
but I think everyone would follow. I think it might be new information, but it's known, like you said, knowledge. Our
Yeah.
soul, we know already. And I think the world
Yes.
is waking up to that,
And
thankfully.
as I break it down, it's going to make more sense. So the first law that he discovered was sort of the main idea that every symptom in the body is a result of a conflict shock. So
Mhm.
that means that sudden dramatic event, that traumatic situation that we go through. For example, in his case, the loss of his child. Maybe for somebody else, they lose that job or they get that phone call, that horrible phone call. Okay. This is a dramatic, sudden, unexpected, acute event that we go through. And it changes our nervous system, right? It's like, think about our body like we're animals in the wild, like the gazelle walking through nature and sees a lion, a sudden traumatic event. So the first biological law is very simple. It's just every symptom in the body is created by an original conflict shock.
Mhm.
And everybody in the conscious community can understand this. It's just, oh, yeah. So my symptoms in my body are a result of a trauma or a sudden conflict event that I'm experiencing.
Like,
Super simple.
for
Yeah.
example, a death or an accident, a car accident, or like those types of experiences, correct?
Totally, but it's all the way about the psyche's perception. So even you can have a conflict in your work environment with your boss where all of a sudden he enters the room and you're conflict active. Your sympathetic nervous system has shifted. Your hands get cold, your heart starts beating, your breath changes. We can all feel these changes in our body when we get triggered. So it's essentially, when do you get triggered? That's a conflict. You're in conflict activity.
It's not
So that
necessarily massive traumatizing experience. It's really something that your just physiological body changes that you're
exactly, because we are no different than animals in the wild. So if we're animals in the wild and we see that lion, our whole nervous system responds into fight or flight so we can best adapt and deal with the situation. Now, the problem is we don't live in a biological society, but our body is still wired this way, so it doesn't know the difference. So, even if you're a child in school and you sit down and you write that test, that's a threat for the psyche if the psyche perceives it that way, right? So, a child who is traumatized by school, when that test paper comes, they enter the sympathetic nervous system and they're in a conflict. Their psyche perceives that as a threatening situation, and the body responds because the body does what's needed to survive. Yeah. So that's the first law, that everything in the body is a result of a conflict shock. Pretty simple to understand. And I sort of went into it in a little bit of the conversation we just had. Our second law is the law of two phases. So that is our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm sure many of you have heard about our circadian rhythm. We have a daytime nervous system and a nighttime nervous system. So just like how I was talking about, we are animals in the wild, the law of two phases shows us that the minute we get this conflict, we change into what we call conflict activity, which is our sympathetic nervous system. So that means we have compulsive thoughts. We're up all night thinking about this problem. We can't sleep. We lose our appetite. Our hands are cold. Our breath changes. Our heart starts racing. All right. So the body is immediately responding us to tell you, hey, you have a conflict here. You need to deal with this. And all our nerves and all our resources are going toward that to help us deal with the situation. All right. So that's the law of two phases. So that's the first phase, our sympathetic phase. And now,
sorry, the first phase is the psychological shock. The second phase is the biological shock.
So it's the first thing is the conflict shock. That was law number one, the conflict shock. And it causes you to enter into sympathetic nervous system, conflict activity. So that's the first phase. I have a conflict. My nervous system changes. I'm in the sympathetic nervous system. And I have these compulsive thoughts. My hands are cold. My heart is racing. I'm up all night. I can't sleep. I mean, we've all been there, right? That's phase one, sympathetic. And now we resolve it. So let's say we lost that job and it was shocking for us, right? And now we resolve it. Maybe we get a phone call and we got that new job, right? Now we go into the second phase. This is our repair phase or healing phase, also called the vagatonic phase. Our parasympathetic nervous system, the nighttime one. This is why when we get sick, we're tired. We need a lot of sleep. We need to rest. We feel lethargic, right? We've entered that parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where everything in the body that adapted at the organ level during that conflict activity gets repaired and restored. And this is where the fever comes in. Maybe it's the vomiting, it's the sneezing, right? Every journey of the body works in this law of two phases. It's just like the spiritual law of cause and effect. It all works in this yin and yang law of two phases. Even when you look at a pregnancy and a birth experience, right? It goes from that sympathetic nervous system to labor, to the epicrisis, the really sudden acute point where it's painful and I'm pushing out my baby and I'm going through this experience, right? And then we go into restoration, healing, on repair, right? So everything in the body works that way. That's our second law, the law of two phases. Yeah.
So that law that said when say you get sick, you're actually going into healing.
Yeah, so we really call sickness biological programs, which is much more empowering, isn't it, than I'm sick. So that means that I had this adaptation where my body is responding to an event that I experienced. And so that depends on the tissue level. So we look at organ by organ. So some organs are producing symptoms already in that conflict activity phase. And some organs are producing the symptoms in the repair phase. Yeah. And we can get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll save some questions for after so we can go
definitely. But no, it's a good question because each organ corresponds to a different brain area and a different brain relay, and we have different germ layers also in our organs. So the cells operate differently for each organ. And that's why we call it a program. And that's why we always look at symptoms in the body at the organ level within that synchronicity in this paradigm, which is actually a lot more empowering than just saying, yeah, I'm sick and I don't know why. Okay.
Well, yeah, and I think people think, well, you are psychic, but not really. But when someone says, oh, this is going on, at least for me, I'll ask, oh, well, did you, just move apartments or something? And they're like,
yeah, what did you just go through, right?
Yeah, depending what it is. Okay, sorry.
100%. Or it's like, when do we get sick? When the family comes home for Christmas and we have all these conversations and the talks, our nervous system has changed, or maybe we've resolved a lot. Maybe we haven't seen our family in forever and we're finally together, like all these things happen. It's crazy, but yes. Yeah. So that's the second law. And then our third law is a little bit more complex. It's all about our ontogenetic system. So that's kind of what I touched on in your question previously, which is the different germ layers. So my third biological law tells me how the organ will adapt. So how the journey will go with that organ according to the ontogenetic system. So the different germ layers, and it actually works together also with our embryology. So it's a very beautiful, synchronistic, magical body that we have. And so different organs in the body have different germ layers that correspond and work differently. So like if I'm looking at our largest organ in the body, it's our skin. Skin is made up of epidermal tissue, yeah, and it is controlled by the cerebral cortex. So this third law of our ontogenetic system helps me understand how the organ will respond. So if I'm looking at the skin, that is a conflict of separation. I feel separated from the person who was on my skin, or I want to separate from this unwanted touch on my skin. Yeah, it's all about separation. Why? Because the skin organ is communication. We touch, it's a sensory organ, and it lies in the cerebral cortex. So the third law in the ontogenetic system tells me how the cells in my skin will respond. So when I experience this separation conflict, let's say maybe I love my partner very much and he sleeps with me in my bed every night on my skin. And now we've broken up and I'm totally in a conflict about this. I'm traumatized by the experience of losing him and I'm sleeping alone in my bed and I can't get over it. Yeah. So let's say my psyche has interpreted this as a separation conflict. I miss the touch of the partner that's no longer there. So this skin cells in the epidermis actually start to ulcerate. So I have diminished sensitivity in my skin. Why? Why does my skin do that? Because it helps me solve the problem. I don't have to feel that this lover is now gone. I have diminished sensitivity. Yeah. So I don't have to feel that the person I'm missing is gone. So most of the time, you don't even notice that. All right. Now, let's say I resolve the problem. I've fallen in love again. Somebody else is back in my bed. And now I wake up in the morning and I have a full body rash. Why? Because in the repair phase, the cells proliferate again to restore the cellular ulceration that happened when I was active in my conflict. So all of that proliferation and the fungi and the microbes, they come to the skin and it gets all red and I have hives and I break out in a rash. All right. So that is my third law, that ontogenetic system. It helps me understand how the cells respond in the tissue layer of the organ. All right. And that's why if you see in this body of work, everything is color coded, and it's color coded. So I know, okay, that organ responds to this brain area and that germ tissue. So I know when I'm conflict active, my cells are going to ulcerate. And then when I'm in my repair phase, they're going to proliferate. So it's the law that helps me understand the journey that the program will take in my body.
Right.
A little bit complex.
No, that was great. I just want to elaborate on that. Have you elaborate on that one a little bit more? Because what you said, it's how your consciousness interpreted, say, your partner being gone as, oh, they're not here, they're not, next to me, and it influences your skin. But what I think is important to mention is, say if you break up with someone and something else happens, you don't get a rash, it could still be from that same thing because you interpreted it in a different way, right? Like you could interpret it like, I'm not safe.
Correct. So let's say you and I were in a room together and somebody comes in and tries to rob us. We're in a conflict. Depending on our psyche, our belief systems, etc., we're going to interpret the conflict a different way. You might interpret it as a scare fright conflict, a breathlessness. Oh my God, somebody's just come in. Yeah. And you might run, a lung program, right? I might interpret it as maybe an indigestible morsel conflict, like, oh my God, somebody's just broken in. I can't stomach this. I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to digest this. I don't know what to do. And I might run, an indigestible program, and I might have some indigestional adaptations that come of that. So yes, that's a very good point. Every person interprets a situation differently. And that's exactly why, like, we could be living in a household together, a family, and we could all get sick at the same time, but we have different symptoms. Maybe one has diarrhea and the other one has fever and the other one has a cough and the next one has a sore throat. So this helps us get really accurate and specific on why, because we all interpreted it a different way. And that's why when we work with the 5 biological laws, it's really empowering because we work organ by organ, symptom by symptom, and you, as an understanding and developing awareness of your own body, you can get more access and clearly pinpoint at the emotional level what your triggers really were and how your body interpreted it. And that's why when I work with clients one-to-one, I'm like, okay, so what was the stuck conflict? No, I don't feel stuck. I don't feel stuck. And then we talk about it and they mention the conflict. I'm like, well, that's pretty serious. I would feel pretty stuck. And they're like, oh yeah, I think I do, right?
Yeah.
So it's working with it that way. And that's why I think it's such an amazing body of work to have no matter what you do, because it helps you get so accurate. And even in the holistic community, okay, we have the idea that our body is responding to our environment and the traumas that we go through, but we're still not clear why. I mean, even allopathic medicine says, yes, stress. Oh, it's stress induced XYZ. Well, that's not very empowering. It's just stress. Wouldn't it be more empowering to know exactly the theme and to be able to work with that and overcome that and move through that so that the body can be better than before, and the psyche can also be stronger than before and less triggered,
Well, I think it
you
also
know?
helps with, I, not to jump forward, but just while it's
Yeah,
on top of my mind, if knowing this type of information, because at least, within my family and when I talk to you, things happen. We're like, okay, let's take a second so that this doesn't become, a biological conflict. And
right.
letting that whole process, yes, it happens, but say when something happens, I can um think a little bit more about it in that moment and recognize that it could cause something, and then that sort of diminishes the effect of it. Would you say?
Exactly. That's what we call downgrading. So that means that, we are not immune from life. Like, we are going to go through things in life, and it doesn't matter how conscious we are, how spiritual we are, etc. We are still going to go through things and traumas and conflicts. So that is the power of the psyche, where we can downgrade, where we can use the tools within ourselves and our resources that resonate with us, that help us to downgrade that conflict. So when we know, like, oh man, we just went through a breakup, or maybe we just lost a loved one, or maybe we just lost our dream job, whatever it might be, these conflicts that we experience, we notice because our nervous system will change, right? We feel that change, that we're triggered. And now we need to really use our awareness to work with that and downgrade. Okay, so maybe for you, Skyla, it's like, okay, that situation just really triggered me. I need to come back to my breath and do my breath work. Maybe for someone else, it's a journaling practice. But I
Mhm.
always say, do what resonates with you, because it has to be in resonance with your psyche. If I just told you, oh, just write down 10 things on a paper that you're grateful for, but if that doesn't resonate with you, that's not going to work for you. So
Mhm.
you have to do tools that resonate with your psyche.
Mhm.
So yes, you're right. That's
Thank
what we call downgrading. Yeah.
you. I just laugh about that one because when things happen, Taish and I are you and I are kind of like, oh well, don't let a biological like conflict happen. Let's
Yeah, don't,
work it
yeah,
through right now.
exactly. Yeah, or I even say to my mom all the time, like, oh, I'm conflict active. And then it's helpful. She's like, okay, what can we do to return your nervous system back to harmony? And that's the beauty of being raised by parents who have this awareness, because it allows children to grow up with a different gnosis of their biology and how it responds to nature, and how we can live in better alignment with nature. So if we're ready, I'll go to the fourth law,
Yes, please and thank
speaking of nature, which is all about microbes. And it's a law that helps us to understand, just like the third law with the ontogenetic system helps us understand how the cells are operating in the adaptation and in the biological program. My fourth biological law tells me all about microbes, fungi, and bacteria, and where and how they will be present in the body, right? And so it actually is one of those really empowering laws where we don't need to live in fear of the scary invisible microbes or the fungi. We have 3.5 pounds of fungi, microbes, and bacteria in our body. And it's kind of like our arsenal that's there to help us and assist us on our healing journey. So that's the fourth law that pretty much just tells me which microbes will be present. So for example, if I'm running a symptom on an organ that's controlled by the brainstem, then I know I'm going to have tuberculosis bacteria present. So there might be some night sweats in my symptom. So
you.
it's a lot to sort of process when you're new. It's like, whoa, do I have to know all that? No, it's okay. You don't have to know all that now, but it's an empowering law to be aware of. So it's not that you have to live in fear of the microbes and the fungi in your body, that you can have the understanding that they're actually there to help you. And having a really good microbiome is like having a lush ecosystem in the forest, so that when you do go through something, so when you do run a symptom at the organ level, you have this healthy, flourishing ecosystem that's going to be used as tools to help you break down that growth that you might have experienced, etc. So it's all there to help us. So that's what our fourth law tells us, essentially, is what microbes, fungi, bacteria are going to be present and when. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're almost through. So after the fourth law is our fifth law, my favorite law, which is called the quintessence. So this is the real bird's eye, eagle view, understanding picture of every program we run in the body. Because the fifth law, quintessence, is like, oh, okay, so not only is the symptom in my body a response to this event or situation that I was dealing with psychologically, but the symptom solves my problem. So when we work with the symptom in the body, we always look at what problem does this biological program solve. So remember when I was talking about the skin and I said it's a separation problem? Well, the quintessence is that I feel separated, so the cells in my skin diminish, so I don't have to feel the touch that's no longer there. So therefore, the symptom solves my problem of that separation. Okay. It's like, likewise, I'll give another example of, let's say we're talking about the digestive tract. So the cells in my digestive tract ulcerate when I feel like something I can't digest, so that I can better receive what it is I need to take in. Yeah. And then likewise, they will proliferate again. So the quintessence law is the one that tells me why did my body respond in that way. So when we look at even Dr. Hummer, who first had the testicular cancer and came up with this hypothesis, he knew, okay, testicular cancer, I received it after the shock of my son dying. But why the testicles? And this is the ingenuity, this is the magic of the body, is that the cells in his testicles proliferated and his testosterone went back up because of the loss of his son. Why? What problem does this solve? Well, testosterone goes up, cells in the testicles proliferate. Now I can better procreate again. I can give life again. All right. So the fifth law, quintessence, tells me that not only is everything because of a conflict, shock, or a trauma, but that the adaptation is actually there to help me overcome. And the adaptation is serving me with this situation, with the conflict theme. Making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just, because while you're saying that, makes absolute sense to me. When did he develop that? Because from my understanding, and maybe science has changed since, but can you mention 9 months? Is that still a thing? If it
For
developed
what?
9 months after?
No, that would be for like some organs, like if you're talking about like a cardio event.
Yeah, because I just remember learning about sometimes symptoms come up, say 9 months after the biological conflict.
No, that's incorrect. Symptoms come either in conflict activity, depending on the organ, or in resolution. The 9-month rule that you're talking about is related to territorial loss, to like a cardiovascular program, like a heart program, where you don't want to run conflict active for 9 months or longer, because the resolution phase will be a heart attack. And if you've ran it for 9 months, then that can be a very fatal resolution.
Well,
So that's the 9 months. Yeah, yeah. That's a little bit more advanced, but good that you remember that, because yeah, that's advanced knowledge of this work, but yes, still very important. And for new listeners here, that's a lot to take in. You don't need to remember that. But one of the points that Skyla is making here, which is important to take into account, is that you do not want to be running conflict active for very long, because remember that second law of two phases.
Mhm.
So, as within, so without, as above, so below. We know this law spiritually, right? So, the intensity of the conflict shock is always equivalent to the intensity of my symptom. So, if I'm in a conflict for a really, really long time, and then I go into repair phase and healing, if that was really intense for me and I ran conflict active in my sympathetic nervous system for a prolonged amount, now my repair phase is going to be probably quite painful and probably quite uncomfortable. And remember, we live in a very anti-biological society, so you can be running many programs at the same time. You can get triggered on different themes all the time. That's why different symptoms in the body can present itself. And this is where we need to do the spiritual conscious work as humans to understand and recognize our patterns. And I think that's the most spiritual thing we can do, to recognize our patterns, right? When we take into account our self development, we start to look at the ways in which we're triggered. We start to look at the ways in which we self sabotage ourselves. And likewise, when we understand our true biology and that our body is always adapting, it's never doing anything wrong, but it's always adapting to what we're experiencing and going through, then we also have to take responsibility for that and do the work. So you're exactly right. You don't want to be running something for months and months on end and going into that sympathetic nervous system, because when you go into repair phase, depending on how your psyche interpreted that event, it can be very uncomfortable and very detrimental to the body, right? But at the end of the day, the goal is that we have this awareness, that we do the work, and that we maybe run through a program, but the organ upgrades and is better than before. So that means every time we go through something at the biological level, when we come out of it, we should be psychologically and biologically stronger than ever before. And I think this is the missing piece, even in the holistic society, is that they're like, oh, yeah, we're spiritual, we're conscious, you have a symptom in the body, but then they're still external with it. They're still like, oh, but there's something wrong. And maybe it's the parasite, and maybe it's your diet, and maybe you didn't do this, maybe you were just too stressed. So we have this beautiful offering of knowledge where it's like, hey, actually, nothing went wrong in your body. Actually, your body is this amazing God vessel that knows exactly what it's doing, that presented you with a biological solution to something that you experienced. And all you have to do is use your awareness to recognize the pattern.
Mhm. So that was one thing I was going to lead into, is because what I have learned so much from you and your mom over the years is about diet. Even though I think we're pretty equally clean,
Mhm.
I grew up slightly more focused on diet and what's good for you and what's bad for you. So the awareness, say when I, growing up, it was don't eat chocolate, it's bad for you. But I come over to your house and you're like, oh no, you're just running a biological like conflict or something. Chocolate's fine. Can you touch on allergies, or what we believe allergies to be and what they actually are biologically?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. So first of all, diet helps as well. I am not dissing your diet. I want to also stress that food that you consume is absolutely important, because it helps us to really have a good human vessel that we're working with. But what we want to clarify is food is not the cause of your symptoms. So food cannot make you sick unless, there's a poison or a toxin in the food. But for example, like let's look at something like a gluten intolerance. If we're all at the dinner table and we're all eating the same pizza, and only you are the one that gets sick from the pizza, then is it the pizza or is it you? Right? So, and we can look at extremely healthy people, right? who eat, really beautiful, lush, nutrient dense diets. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, I just got a cancer diagnosis.
Mm.
Well, why? And they don't understand why, right? And it's because food does not cause disease. Food is an amazing support system for our body, and it is vital and it is important, but is not the cause of disease. And you want to be wary of that because you don't want to develop tracks and triggers with food. So remember, I was talking about how the psyche doesn't know a difference between threats. So
Mhm.
if you perceive food as a threat, your body can respond with an adaptation. And I'll use myself as an example. When I was a child, I was lactose intolerant. And when my mom found this work, she came and she sat me down and she said, okay, lactose intolerance. This
Wait,
isn't, yeah,
I just, because I know how you say it. She sat
yeah.
you down and what'd she say? Natasha.
Yeah,
How
exactly. She
you
was like,
started.
Natasha, what can you remember? My mom, my German mother, she's like, what can you remember with the milk, right? So I had to think about it. And when I thought about it, I remembered this situation when I was 7 years old, and my dad had come home from work on a very stressful day. He was very upset. He just wanted to have his dinner. And I was young and I thought I could pour the big jug of milk all by myself. And I dropped it and I spilled it all over the dinner table and it ruined the dinner. And I remember my dad was already so upset that he had a really big outburst, and then there was a really big fight between my parents at the dinner table that night. So, how did my psyche perceive that? As what we call the indigestible morsel. Oh my God, I can't stomach to see my parents fighting, right? So, every time I drank milk after, my body, your brain is a supercomputer. It remembers when you're in that conflict shock, it knows who you were with, what you were wearing, what you were eating, what season it was, what smells were in the air. Like it records all this data. So
Hmm.
after that experience, my body perceived the milk as a threat. It said, oh, Natasha, watch out with the milk. Remember what happened the last time? So it perceived it as the indigestible morsel. So every time I drank milk, my body ran this organ adaptation through my digestive tract. And every time I would get upset stomach after, to the point where, my mom cut out all dairy for me and I was drinking almond milk and rice milk like before that was even cool. Okay. Like now everyone's drinking it. But anyway, before it was cool. So when she found this work, she sat me down and she poured me a glass of milk and she said, okay, now that you understand this, now that you remember this situation, do you think you could let go of the threat? Do you think you can understand now that it's not the milk that's the threat and that you don't need this adaptation anymore? And can you talk to yourself? Can you tell yourself it's safe to drink the milk? I don't need to see it as threatening anymore. And I did, and I never had it since. So now I drink raw milk almost every day. So I'm a living testament, but allergies are one of my favorite things to work with people because it's really easy to overcome the trigger. And this is why actually our ancestors always blessed the food. You sat down at the table when you ate, you didn't speak. Actually, when you go to India, you eat with your hands crisscross, you bless your food, and you do not speak while you eat. And when you look at our biology, you can understand why, because you're developing this harmonious relationship. So then you'll never have triggers or tracks with food. And this is what I wish could be also a little bit more understood in the holistic community, that we don't need to develop these tracks and triggers, that we can actually understand that our bodies are natural detoxifying machines. So, like you urinate, you go to the bathroom, you sweat, everything is already detoxing. And so, yes, we want to obviously be aware of what we put in our body, but we don't need to develop these so called allergies, you know?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's so great because it reminds me of I don't like to say I am allergic, but I have an allergy sort of
Mm-hmm.
to dogs, as you know. But it's so interesting
Yes.
because same thing, my mom, okay, when was the first experience you had with a dog? I'm allergic. Well, okay, the saliva affects me. so I think, well, when did I have an experience with dog saliva? But I actually remember so clearly. I was probably around the same age, 7. I went for a walk with my aunt to the park, and I liked to climb trees, so I climbed a tree, and I remember I fell, which usually it's fine, but there was a fence under me, and it scratched my leg all the way down, like a big gash. And then this dog was running over to me, trying to lick me at my
Mm,
gash. And I was so scared that the dog was gonna like, was trying to lick the cut. So that was like, oh, that makes so much sense why I'm, because it's such a bizarre thing to be allergic to dog saliva. But I
right.
back to this, oh, it was such a significant event. I was so scared, and I, was too young to be like, I didn't know what to do. Um, and so that's just, this knowledge has brought, I'm still working on it because I'm still figuring out how to get over it exactly or understand it. But that, I think, has changed my reaction to animals as I've grown up.
Yeah, and it's also the allergy becomes this sort of self-fulfilled prophecy because now you know that did you have a rash with the dog saliva? So now you know that every time the dog licks you, you get this rash. So it's hard for you all these years later to not perceive the dog as a threat because now it's like every time you got the rash, it reminded you that the saliva was a threat, so it amplified it for you too, right? Because it reinforced the belief system,
Yeah.
but that's why I like this work because we always follow the 100% rule. So like if I can be around the dog and be licked by the dog, we have the same body, the same organisms, the same, the same
Yeah,
vessel that we're working with, same biology, yeah? So you can get there too. And it's really quite empowering. And I always like to remind people knowing this work does not make us superhuman, but it allows us to recognize that being human is super. So it doesn't mean you need to now beat yourself up because you know the conflict and you might still, break out a little bit when you're around dogs. You might still react at the biological level, at the organ level, but it's not that you need to shame yourself for that. It's just you have an awareness now. So that helps you because you know now how to work with it
hmm
and you know how to downgrade it. And maybe you will eventually get to the point where it'll be gone.
yeah.
And that's why I always remind people it's like, do you remember? Like, I remember in my childhood, there were so many little things that I would get as a child that I just don't get anymore as an adult. Why? Because I've matured. So I'm no longer triggered by the same things in the same way, right? So like
Yeah.
we all had this memories of like I have friends who are like, "Oh, when I was a kid, I used to always get rashes," or like, "Oh, when I was a child, I used to always get warts. Now I never do," right? So all these programs that we ran as a kid that we never even experienced today. Well, it's like because those emotional themes with our maturity and time and wisdom are just no longer important to us.
I think that also explains too how some allergies get developed when people are,
Yeah.
it's such a bizarre thing to develop an allergy in my mind at least, but this explains it.
Yeah. 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 And that's why I always say, like, this is my my one of my main purposes. I would love to have young people know this information because I feel so privileged in the way that I was raised to move through life with an awareness where I never had to live in fear of my body. And
Mhm.
I think if we can teach young people in our generation this work so that they can raise their families in this way too, then we are really revolutionizing the system. And that's sort of been my goal. And that's why one of my favorite course programs that my mom and I teach together is on women's health, where we go through and examine menstruation because actually like menstruation is not meant to be biologically painful, and most women are actually running menstruation just like an allergy where they're triggered every time it comes. Like how many times has your girlfriend said to you, "Ugh, I got my period today"?
Mm.
It's like, what? This is the most amazing sacred thing that our body does that reminds us of our ability to give life and create. And we look at each other and we're like, ugh, I got my period. Like, I always check my girlfriends. I'm like, no, 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 no. Or likewise, we've been so shamed about it that we develop sometimes the track for when our very first period starts. We get our first period and we're traumatized, right? And now it's like the period almost runs like an allergy. Okay. So that's another one of my specialties. I really love to work with women on their menstruation and then pregnancy as well. So we look at how can we have a natural harmonious pregnancy and birthing experience, because that's also our birthright as women, that we can experience that, and our biology is actually also designed for us to experience and go through that process as well, right? And so I think we as women, it's so important for us to understand this, and anybody who's really delving into this conscious and spiritual work, I really encourage you to empower yourself to know your biology, because it will just completely change the way you weave through life. And it allows you to sort of give birth to this new revolution and new generation of way showers that are understanding the true alchemy of how our body works.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is so valuable. And I will just mention too, just as you're saying all this about feeling shame, it's fascinating because, say, for, anaphylaxis and
Mm-hmm.
exercise, I
Mm-hmm.
as something towards the end of high school, I developed what's called exercise-induced anaphylaxis, and I thought it was so bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going my whole life totally fine, and then all of a sudden, so I thought, knowing this and working with this knowledge, I've worked through it, right? And then
Yeah.
I work with it, and I thought, okay, I'm good. I've resolved this, and then it actually came up about 2 months ago, and I found most people, say for that situation, are scared for their life because it's a life or death situation, and it could be lethal.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I find what's hardest is that I then go, where's my psyche at? Like, how I know I am doing this, what is going on? So I just wanted to say, for people where I think, listening to you, Tash, it seems like, okay, this is such empowering information, which it is, and it's absolutely life changing. But along the path, I think you can still go through phases where you're going to be learning of, okay, I'm working through it, but I'm not completely done yet. But don't give up on this, because we just haven't sort of unlocked that yet for your own self. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a work, it's a practice too, I think. It's not just knowledge. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also how hilarious that diagnosis, like exercise induced anaphylaxis. You exercise every day, don't you? Anyone knows that you exercise every day. And do you have the anaphylaxis every day? Yeah, so
No,
then that's a totally false diagnosis. And then you are not running exercise induced anaphylaxis, because you exercise every single day and you
yeah.
don't have an anaphylactic attack every single day. So
Yeah.
already, like, throw out the diagnosis. And that's why, like, we never work with the diagnosis when we work with the client. We always work with the organ. And I think that's actually a much more efficient way to work, because we're like, okay, well, okay, so your diagnosis with like blah blah blah, like 15 badillion words with like 17 different symptoms included in that diagnosis. And then I'm just like, wow, let's just work with your organ that's actually adapting. Because remember, like, all of this information was codified through his access to brain scans. So that means he saw at the brain level a little focus point which was running at the relay of the brain that controlled that organ. And that's why we work organ by organ, because when we scan your brain and you're running a symptom at the organ level, when I look at your brain scan and I look at the relay that controls that organ, I see this little pinpoint, which we call a little focus point, that shows me that there's an organ running there. So that proves to me with evidence that the psyche and the brain and the organ are working in synchronicity. And therefore, when I work with the client, I'm working at, okay, sure, that was your diagnosis, but what symptom are you actually experiencing? And nowadays, like, people can get diagnosed with like an array of things, or they can go to one doctor and get one diagnosis and then a different one and then get another. So it's much more efficient to actually deal with the organs that are adapting. So that's why I think it's just absolutely hilarious that you, a fitness instructor who works out every day, gets diagnosed with this. But it's like, what did you resolve? Like, I remember the day your sister came back,
Exactly.
you had a resolution,
Yep.
you had an anaphylactic shock. So was it the workout, or was it this monumentous resolution of finally reuniting with your sister? Because remember, anaphylaxis is the epicrisis. So if we remember that second biological law, the law of two phases, that anaphylactic shock happens in the repair phase, and it's what we call the epicrisis, that really intense acute point of biological healing and restoration, which is the anaphylactic shock. And yes, you're absolutely right, it's still something you need to be concerned about. So you still probably need to have your EpiPen with you just in case you have one, and that's okay, but you recognize the pattern.
That's, I think, well, talking to you just this past, I guess, year, because it hadn't happened in years, because I thought, okay, I've worked through it, I understand it, I accept it all, and all of the above. And then I called Tash, because I call Tash all the time, or something's going on. I'm like, hey, babe, what does this mean? Then she
Yeah.
elaborates. She go, well, what happened? And it made so much sense, as Tasha had got home after basically you hadn't seen her in a year, and I had never been that far or long, and I was so nervous kind of that whole year. Finally, she's coming home. There I am, end up in the hospital. I'm like, hey, oh my God, but this makes sense. And then it happened a few months ago, and I thought, well, this is just okay, what's going on? But my friends had gotten engaged that day. It wasn't just a random day, it was such a significant day. Then I told my
Mhm.
friends, I'm like, no, no, I'm okay. I think I'm just really happy to see your love. And then she goes, did I get like put you in anaphylactic? I'm sorry. I'm like, no, no, no. I'm so happy. Like, I didn't realize how important this was to me for you, that it's affecting my body this much.
Right. And that's also what some people don't understand. It's like, oh, everything is going well in my life. I got everything I wanted, and now I'm getting sick. And it's like, yeah, but that's old paradigm. When I run an adaptation at the organ level, first of all, I never call anything sickness. I never call anything a disease. To for something to be malignant, to be malign, is literally translated as evil in the body. Okay. I do not operate under the paradigm where there is any evil going on in my body. Yeah. So I always say biological program, and I love it when I get something. I'm actually fascinated by the magic of it, and I celebrate it and I welcome it. And sometimes I'll even like move through a meditation and just be like, okay, I know I haven't reached that epicrisis yet. Like, I know I'm running a stomach program and I haven't thrown up yet. I'm going to like call in my guides and ask this epicrisis to come. I want to just purge whatever's left of this conflict and move on. So sometimes I'll even set like a date. I'll be like, no, okay, by this evening, I want to reach epicrisis so I can feel better by tomorrow. And
Yes.
honestly, with that awareness, my body almost always responds. And like, this is the such beautiful magic and wisdom of the body that we neglect. Like, we have in our cerebral cortex and pineal gland, we have magnetite crystals that connect to the electromagnetic field of the earth in
Yes.
our cerebral cortex, and that is the area of our skin. So that means like our skin, when we put our hands in the soil and our feet in the soil, we're connected to the electromagnetic field of the earth. Like, how incredible is that? And we just literally forget all of this. It's insane. Or it's so funny when my mom and I teach this work together, this work happens to appeal to a lot of people in the conscious community. And then they sit in the classroom, they're like, oh, well, this is boring. I have to learn about biology and germ layers. Oh, I didn't think it was going to be like this. And I'm
Oh,
like, you
yes,
have no idea how spiritual this is. And
it
then
is.
they ask me at the end of class, like, oh, but like, how can we add in a spiritual perspective? I'm like, knowing your God-given vessel. Like, this is the only
Yeah.
pathway. This is your portal to coming to this earthly realm, is this body that you're living in. Don't you think you'd want to know how it works? Because you're going to leave it behind and
Yeah.
it's going to go back to the earth. And your only sort of ticket to God to come into this realm is this skin suit. So don't you think it would be much better if you knew how it worked? Like, biology to me is the most sacred learning and offering that we can do as humans.
It's funny when throughout high school, I thought I don't like sciences, not for me. Then I graduated and I started learning about the body, and I was like,
Uh-huh.
oh my God, the body is the most fascinating thing in this entire world. Like, I want to study it. I love it. I'm obsessed with anatomy. Everything. But what you study is different. And I think what's so, um, just maybe not completely understood is when you explain it, or when I explain it. Obviously, I don't have the depth of knowledge that you elaborate on, but it sounds almost sort of like, oh, this, psychology of disease type thing. But really, it's when, I've done a course, I did one with Natasha's mom, I don't know, when she was in LA,
Mhm.
hang out with her mom all the time, love her.
Yeah.
Did the course together, and that was when I realized, oh my God, this is all you're learning, the layers of the organs, right? It's not
Yeah.
sort of like how these things sort of tie together. You're actually really truly studying each layer of cells.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
we're studying the different brain areas of the brain. We have to know which organ is controlled by what brain area, what germ tissue, etc. So yeah, it can feel like a lot. And actually, when this work was codified, it was not meant for the general public. He had the idea in mind that medical doctors would use this work and still incorporate it into their practice, into a deeper understanding and level of nature and how the body works. And of course, it was not recognized by the medical community because it was very threatening to a very profitable system. So that was when he decided he would teach it to the general public, because he felt it was his mission in life to bring this knowledge forth. And I also want to mention, we also go beyond organ symptoms. So when we study the different brain area, we also look at psychosis through these lens. And I love the way this work looks at psychosis, because we never say you have a mental health problem or a psychological problem. What we actually call them is constellations, because when we scan your brain, constellations are when we have two conflicts. Remember, that conflict shock that we experience registers immediately at the brain level. So when he would scan the brain and examine your brain scan, your CT scan, he would see these little focus points, and they would look like constellations in the night sky. So he would say to you, there's nothing wrong with you. You just experienced a constellation. And that proves with evidence that the traumas that we go through influence our psychological behavior changes, right? So when we look at constellations, like anorexia is a constellation, so is bulimia, megalomania, that's the narcissistic constellation, right? Kleptomania is a constellation, depression is a constellation. These are happening at the brain level. So when you know this work, not only can you work with your symptoms in the body better, but you can also help to understand your own constellations, because we're all constellated, you know? And I love to also work with the temporal lobe. It's like this area that goes like around your ears here. And the temporal lobe, when it registers conflicts, they actually influence our hormones, right? So when a female goes through a sexual conflict, it's like the psyche interprets for her, like, it's not safe for me to be a woman in this world. So her estrogen goes down and her testosterone goes up. All right. When she has this sexual conflict. So it's like when we're looking at ourselves as women in society today, it's really remarkable because we look at the woman, she's the CEO, she's the go-getter, she's this. Why is she like that? Why is she behaviorally inclined to do that? And it's probably because she experienced these conflicts and the level of the temporal lobe, and her testosterone goes up. Or we have so many women nowadays today who are like, oh, actually, I don't want to have children. Okay, well, that's fine. If that's your choice, nothing wrong on that. No judgment there. But from our point of view, from this perspective, it's really interesting to look at because your biological nature is designed for you to want children because you're a female in this world and you give life and you procreate. Why is your biology designed that way? Because if it wasn't, then we would never survive as a species. If your biology as a woman was like, oh, it's okay, I think I'll just chase a career and not kids, well,
Yeah.
then we wouldn't survive as humans. So,
Yeah.
the biology of the female, the estrogen is our bonding relationship hormone
Mm.
that makes us have this inclination to want a family, to want children, right? So when we look at someone who's like, hey, like, I really want to get back into my femininity, like, how many times do you go on Instagram and you scroll through and it's like, divine feminine workshop, get back into your goddess energy, right? And I just laugh because I'm like, oh, you just resolve some of your sexual conflicts, your estrogen would go back up again and you would become feminine again, right? But we live in such a conflicted society, and we're told as women that we should go out there and conquer the world, not understanding. And it's okay if you still want to do all those things, but it's also important to have the awareness of why. Like, it's totally okay if you choose not to have children, but it's different if you're denying your body of having children, like going on birth control. So
Yeah.
I'm happy, like, I love working with women on menstruation and fertility and all of those things because when the amount of women that have gotten pregnant or gotten their periods back or become in touch with their femininity in a whole new way, like just that work that I've done, like I could die, like that's good enough for me. Yeah, because I think it's so important. And like you
So important.
probably have all these female entrepreneurs listening that
Yeah.
have gone down that pathway that are like, I'm going to get that job. I'm going to conquer the world. I'm going to get my house and do this. And then
Yeah.
they do all that and they're like, oh, wait a moment. And it's like, yeah, well, because you missed the point a little bit that your biology is actually calling you to do something.
It's funny you say that. I just had a conversation with my girlfriends who, we're all quite ambitious, go-getter, business
Yeah,
mindset vibes, just sort of wrap up of 2023 and goals for 2024. And we all, and I've my complete, goal setting has completely shifted over the past year of how I set intentions for myself and visualize my future than it was a few years ago. And all of us had said, like, we just completely let go of all of that. It was like, we want babies.
yeah,
Whatever happens from now until the babies arrive, peace and love, like that. Just it and then I find with that too, whatever's meant to be, those sort of career aspirations will most likely still happen if they're aligned for you, because that's just your path. But if you let
totally.
go of the attachment to it, then it can flow to you. But when you're holding on,
Yes.
it's like,
100%, 100%. And so that's just like using your awareness with it, right? And this is why it's also important to know this work because we're living in a world that's very anti-biological. So we're getting conflicts all the time. Probably just opening up your phone and, seeing what's going on in the world is changing our nervous system and, creating these conflicts and also constellations, etc., that are happening. So that's why we want to use our awareness of the mind, body, spirit all together so that we can really revolutionize what's going on. It's like if we want to be the change, we wish to see. And this is like the spiritual work of embodiment of like, okay, not only am I talking my talk, but I am walking my walk, right? And so it's even like, I see so many women who are like, oh yeah, I can just sleep around and have casual sex. I'm like, yeah, if you have high testosterone, you can do that because you won't release a lot of oxytocin, and then therefore you won't have much of a bond. But if you did have a lot of estrogen, that wouldn't work for you anymore. And now we like shame that girl and say like, oh, she's a prude and like she just wants to become a mother. Like I remember I was just having a conversation and this woman asked me what my purpose was in life, and I said, to be a mother. That's my purpose. That's what I would like to do. And she was so appalled by that answer. She
Wow.
was, very triggered. Like, that's not all there is in life. And she really didn't like the response. And I just laughed because I thought it was so funny. And I didn't look at it badly because I was like,
Yeah.
you know what, from your experiences and maybe what you've gone through in society, that might be your perspective, and that's okay. But we can be the change now to embody our nature and come back to our true nature and our roots, and we can empower others to do the same.
Yeah. And well, I
Yeah.
also think society's influence on that specific example is a huge thing because same for me. I came across a timeline that I wrote in grade 12, so I would have been 17 at the time. It was hilarious because it was just, graduate high school, go to university, graduate university, a couple years later, it was start dating, get engaged, get married, have my first child, second child, third child. There was nothing else on the timeline. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, from the beginning of my life, all I've ever
Well, you're also a hormonal teenager, so that estrogen was probably really high.
But it's like
Really.
it's truly that like obviously I have all these other aspirations, but they're just sort of for fun. The ultimate goal is like I just can't I'm so excited for that family and that
Hmm.
stage, but I also didn't want to rush to it. So it's like, okay, in the meantime, let's make all these other goals because why not? And then when
Yeah.
time is there, we'll follow my biological clock. And that's why it's called the biological clock, right? Because my mom always
Yeah.
says same to my or like whatever the age is, it sort of starts to tick and you go, okay, I want babies. And then it's like, well, it's for a reason.
Yeah, totally. And you know what? Men go through the same thing in the society that we live in too, right? So, like, also their biology is designed to protect and provide and procreate. Why? So that they can protect and provide and procreate for the mother, and she can protect and provide for her children. And he would die for the mother, and the mother would die for her children. And why does biology work that way? Again, to ensure the survival of the species. So, like men are also biologically inclined to want to go out and accumulate resources and establish a territory so that they could do that. And that's why the testosterone is very action oriented to go out and do something. And likewise, like our society has now glorified a very more passive estrogen dominant male. So they're going through this just like we as women are of like, wait a moment, what does it really mean for me to be a biological male, right? So they're going through the same thing where it's like society is telling them one way to be a man in the world, and their biology is sort of hinting at them to do something different. So that's why I say, like, even with my mentor, who is still reading and working with the brain scans in his medical practice today, he is really saying that the way to move forward is to establish a strong family unit. And if you have a conscious family unit that is working toward raising their children with this understanding and awareness, then that's how we change the world. And he says, like, the most important people that you can teach this work to are mothers and future mothers, so that the new generation can grow up with this awareness because our ancestors already knew this, And
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on how nefarious you think the powers that be are. I mean, that's up to every individual to come to terms with. But even from a spiritual perspective, like the calcification of the pineal gland, that conflict at the biological level is actually being kept in the dark. So it's like, who do you think is trying to keep us in the dark? Like, I really know that there's this society out there that is in a system that's also trying to keep us in the dark. That's why we're having like a spiritual revolution awakening. And what do all these psychedelics do? They open up the pineal gland. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like really hilarious to watch all these things.
Yeah.
And I think like for you, it's funny too, because like we just grew up this way with this spiritual understanding. And it's like, yeah, now I work in the spiritual field, but I also like I also see the corruption in that way too. Cause it's like, I don't know, is this like a business or is this like an awakening? Or like there's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
of things that go on as well. So I think it's just important that just come back to nature, come back home, you
yeah.
know?
Well, I
Yeah.
think so, and I wanted to tie into I mean, so many other conversations on this feminine masculine, but I think I'll save that for
Yes.
another day because
But
that's
yeah, that's a whole
that's
episode
a
for
whole one.
sure.
But
Yeah.
while we're on just what you've just said and tying it back, because then I want to ask about your diet, but
Hmm.
and I think why the majority of the population is in the dark is because so what closes the pineal gland? Toothpaste, right? Like that's something that the majority of the population have these toothpaste that they use every
Oh,
morning.
the fluoride, you mean?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you for clarifying. Fluoride toothpaste, right? That closes the pineal gland. And that's something that we're why I think it's so you can elaborate on this, but
Yeah.
why I think we are so different is because we haven't necessarily had this like grown up one way and then transitioned where now we're just sort of starting to understand it. From a very
Hmm.
young age, I think our mothers fed us very clean, sort of spiritually awakened food almost. And they,
Hmm.
didn't give us cereal and dairy for breakfast and didn't give us fluoride toothpaste. So our pineal
Yeah, yeah.
never closed. Where I think that's why, I'm
Right, but actually, so that's where we need to go into the biology of it though, because pineal glands have been calcified even before we had the fluoride toothpaste. So why, right? So the calcification of the pineal gland is actually also a biological adaptation as well. Just the same way that like my, my psychic work that I do when I work as an intuitive in a one-on-one session is also a biological response. So I see more, right? I'm a more visual, I receive vision. So that actually is happening in my visual cortex, which is a conflict of a fear in the neck. So it's a fear of a predator coming to get you. And I remember the original sort of conflict that sort of opened up my ability to see these visions. I remember that trauma, right? And that's why so many people also report having a spiritual awakening after they went through a traumatic event. And it's because your body is adapting, and that we can see in the level of constellation. So when we look at like someone who's a yogi, who's into spirituality, psychedelics, like everyone like you and I, we call that the post-mortal constellation. That's the obsession with
yeah.
life beyond death, what happens after this. And the emotional thing of that is that like the trauma was too intense here, so I must rise above. It's too bad here in the human form, so I must focus on the afterlife. So that's where we get like into the flying constellation and the post-mortal. So like, yes, what you're saying about like toxins, like yes, fluoride is a toxin, it's not good for your body, you shouldn't consume it, but we still have to follow the 100% rule, which is
Okay.
pineal glands were still being calcified.
Okay, well, that I'm gonna take it as a sign that this podcast has come to a finish because, oh man, the divine is so beautiful.
Okay.
She's back. Um, well, okay, so trusting the divine wherever it's leading us, I think we're gonna save that conversation for another day, as it was.
Yeah, that's my Costa Rican internet connection over here.
Yeah, I was talking a little bit when you cut out and just said, "Oh, she's in Costa Rica right now," but
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, you can't control what happens in the jungle. It's nature.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
No, thank you for elaborating on all of that. I learn from you every day, and I am forever grateful that I get to be not just a best friend, but a sister and a soulmate connection and all of these things. Like I consider myself the luckiest person in the world. So I'm so grateful that we get to share these conversations with other people. I was saying to myself when you were off of just how we've always had, you've been kind of the one person in my life that I've been able to just throughout growing up have these types of conversations with that were so against the norm, and having that
Right.
relationship has just been so grounding because it's like, okay, I'm not crazy. Tash is on the same page. Like we're just odd ducklings, but we're awake. Uh,
Totally. And that's the importance of community, right? And that's why it's so important that we share what we know and we learn from each other and we co-create with one another, because even like when you know this work, okay, yes, all right, I know it, but then maybe someone else has a method that really helps me to overcome that conflict, to resolve that issue. So that's why I'm all right. Now I know what it is. Now I know the emotional theme behind this adaptation, but now maybe somebody has something they can offer me that will help assist me in coming back into my harmonious nervous system again, right? But ultimately, like, we are the healer, we are the shaman, we are the doctor.
mhm.
Our body knows already what
Yeah.
it needs, and our body has the solution already
Mhm.
to help us survive.
Mhm. Well, so many questions. Well, okay, so much more obviously that I'd love to get into, but they're big conversations. And I know it's taking up part of your day, but I just want to ask, what would be sort of one mantra or quote or something that one that you say to yourself or that you would share with somebody else stepping into this new world that could be so foreign, but just what's a mantra that you would share with maybe your younger self?
I always love this like Anais Nin quote. I think it's, and then came the day where the risk to remain tight in a bud was greater than the risk it took to bloom. And I just feel that's kind of where we're at in humanity right now, where it's almost when you know what you know, there's no going back anymore. So when you have this awareness and you have this gnosis of who you are and why you're here, and that you're meant for a greater purpose and that there's magic inside of you, then all of a sudden the risk to become small again in that bud, it becomes very, very daunting. And so I really think that's like the pivotal tipping point for so many of us as we go through this journey of life, where it's eventually we get to the point in our journey and our evolution where it's just riskier to play it small. And so we have to bloom. And I think that's been even true for my journey as an entrepreneur, where I thought I knew what I would do with things. And
Mhm.
then it led me another way. And it's like, no manifestation could have ever got me where I was now. Like, I could never have dreamt this up, even like working one-on-one with clients just intuitively through my intuitive work, using my constellations, getting to teach people all over the world this information and bring in other speakers and authors and educators to teach as well. It's so beautiful because at the end of the day, like, we all want that community. Like, we all want to feel like how you and I feel, where
Mhm.
we can call that best friend and
Mhm.
have each other to lean on.
Mhm.
And so I just really feel that that's where we're at in humanity. And that's where I've come to the point in this work where I just know what I know, and I've observed so much. And
Mhm.
I've gone through my own experience with observing myself and my own body and my own spiritual journey to know that this is the way for me, and to help others if it resonates with them and if they want to pursue this road,
Mhm.
then we're all helping each other bloom, and eventually all the flowers in the garden will bloom.
Yes. And it's funny now when you say that, you hadn't imagined that years before, but seeing you do what you do now, I can't imagine other, like, this has always been you. This has
I
always
know.
been you, where it's like, duh,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
Natasha. This is just this,
Yeah.
like, it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It's
And
true.
it's so funny because I'm here in Costa Rica because I was just singing. I work with a lot of frequency and sound and things like that too. And I was always a dancer performer. So it's a nice little segue for me. And I was just singing with the singer Deva Pramal, and I was telling her that I grew up listening to her music with my hippie mom, and like, and the journey to now sit in Costa Rica and sing with her. And I was explaining to her how I sort of went down this other path of career and thinking I was going to do something and be in Hollywood and entertainment, and how eventually I found my way home. And she's such a sweetheart. And she just looked at me and smiled, and she goes, well, good thing it didn't take you very long then. it
True.
was
That's
it was
true.
only a few years and you found your way back home. And
True.
that's so true. All roads lead to home. So it doesn't matter like what you do, all roads lead home.
Yeah. Well, I think there was a stage when you weren't sure about kids, right? It's like,
Yeah, maybe I was too high in testosterone.
it goes to show just how much life can change in such a short amount of time because we're still so young. So all of the stuff we've really done has only been in the last 10 years besides
Yeah.
high school. But it's just so fascinating how I think it's not as daunting to come home as it is once you just like, yeah,
Yeah.
forget what there was a conversation you and I were having and a few other people not too long ago, and it was just hilarious because I was sort of watching from afar, and you were simply so like, well, you just decide, like you just do it. Like it was so clear to you, and then somebody else, I'm like, yeah, but Tash, you can't talk to someone like that when they're just not there yet. Like you know what I mean? They don't, that doesn't make sense. But I think what you were explaining is, but it's just so simple. Like you just, kind of go home. Like it's just, everything just is exactly how it is and all is well in the world. And it was like
Yeah.
such a beautiful perspective. And I think how, yes, you've done a lot of work to get there, but in reality, the path is quite straightforward and simple.
For sure. And I've always been a radical rebel. So I think it's just like totally in my destiny to just continue to be like a crazy radical rebel. I'm never afraid to ruffle any feathers. So that's
Oh, I
that's
know.
really important in the work that I do too. You can't really be afraid about what other people think about you,
Yeah.
and you can't really be afraid to ruffle anyone's feathers
No,
either.
I
So
think it's
that's all
great.
right.
I think it's exactly what the world needs is your light.
Yeah, and I think there's like what the world needs also. I think there's like an awakening happening at a global scale that's just
Yeah.
happening from a godly power even beyond ourselves. So I think those that are like riding this wave are the ones who are ready to, and eventually everybody will be there anyway. So, you know, I think this is one of the most beautiful moments on humanity that there ever was. And we're having this like renaissance that's so incredible. I think how could you not join this bandwagon, you know?
Absolutely. It's so extraordinary. And it just makes life so much easier because everything
Yeah.
is fine. And you're like, somebody was telling me that the other day, they said, your faith or your trust is like they admire it. And it was such an interesting thing to me to admire because I guess for me, but that's like what we all are.
I know. Or when people say like they admire your spiritual practice, it's like we're all spiritual, we're spirit. Like there's no way that you're not spiritual.
Yeah, yeah. Like, where's your? That's okay. You take your sweet time. I'm here for you when you're ready. But yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your energy and your light with me today and the world every day. I'm so grateful to have you in my life. I'm sure you have an idea, but I don't know if you know the depths of how much love I have for you. And I think about you every day, or I'm far away in the world and I'm isolated. And I honestly, when I moved to Australia, I thought, wow, I'm really alone. And then I thought, well, I'm not. And I'm also privileged because if I have one good friend where I cannot talk to you for a year, but I know that I can always call you, where that's another conversation to go on about value of friendship. But this is Tash. She's my person. So thank you for being my person. I love you more than
Aw.
anything.
Thanks for being my soul sister and
Yes,
another rebel radical in
yes, of
humanity,
course.
using their
Absolutely.
platform to sow
Sure.
the seeds of awakening. I love it. So thank you for having me on. And it's always a pleasure to hang out with you, even through a a
I know,
podcast.
virtually through across the world, as we always usually are, far away physically, but never spiritually.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
well, stay tuned for more conversations with Tash because she is so fascinating to dive into her mind. All right. Have the best day of your life, my little lovers.
Thank you.